Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you. I'm Meri Fatin. And thank you so much to James Seaton for organising this event tonight. It's very exciting. Before I introduce you to Lionel Shriver, I just want to let you know that you'll see in the bottom of your screen there's a little icon that says Q&A. So at any stage, you're welcome to type a question for Lionel, and I will be able to see that, and I will then just throw that into the mix where I see it being available. So that question, your question, you'll only be able to see it, and I'll be able to see it. Nobody else will be able to see it. So don't be embarrassed. Please throw in your questions if you'd like to. I am so pleased to welcome American novelist and journalist Lionel Shriver from her home in London. Welcome, Lionel.
Oh, it's nice to not be there.
I bet that's actually true, because it's a bit of a drag promoting books, isn't it? When you've got to schlep around the globe and get to every radio station and TV station in town. Has this been a bit of a mystery?
Well, you know what it's like to do the flight from Europe. So this is a hell of a lot easier than Qantas.
Yeah, well, I bet we were just talking beforehand about how you attended one of your interviews a few days ago in an apron in the process of baking a cake.
I know the whole protocol of appearing on TV is completely changed. You know, I would never have shown up in an apron for news night in times previous. But I really like the breaking down of barriers and the fact that we're now talking to each other in each other's kitchens. I think the texture of the news has improved. It's less formal, and you get a better feel for who people really are.
Yeah, very true. And we get to turn up with ISO hair and ISO fingernails and all the other things that we just cannot possibly pay attention to at the moment. I would like to introduce you properly, if you don't mind.
Okay.
We are here to talk about Lionel's new novel, The Motion of the Body Through Space, and it is about primarily the cult of exercise. But I really want to make sure that everyone knows that Lionel has actually written 15 novels. The most famous, of course, is her 8th, We Need to Talk About Kevin, which won the prestigious Orange Prize in 2005, after having been rejected by an inordinate amount of publishers, I guess possibly all in the spirit of the mythical overnight success. Lionel Shriver has called herself a renowned iconoclast. Her writing is prized for its rapier wit, leaving no sensitivity or belief or being, including herself, unscathed. Her determination to maintain jurisdiction over her imagination, her resistance to the new rules around cultural appropriation and political correctness has in recent years become more of a story than her work itself in some respects. And now, as I mentioned, the cult of exercise, as well as aging, familial aggravations, long-term relationships, all get singed under Lionel Shriver's microscope in The Motion of the Body Through Space. May I formally welcome you to Australia, Lionel Shriver, and congratulations on this fabulous new book.
Thank you so much, and may I formally thank you for having me.
Yes, we've done well to organise it. Now, you said that you feel that a book needs to justify its existence in your life. And I'm really interested because you always tackle very big, like the central theme of your books is often a big topic. How did you come to feel that the cult of exercise was a big enough topic for you to get your teeth into?
Well, I was a little concerned at first, before I got started, about whether or not exercise, of all things, was a meaty enough topic for me to take on, and never mind my time. I'm always having to be concerned with my readers' time. So was that substantial enough to be worth the hours that it would take for you to read the book? So I began with a slight self-skepticism. But as I got into it, I realized that it isn't a small issue, partly because it ends up hitting on timeless topics like aging and mortality. We seem to rely heavily on exercise now to convince ourselves that as long as we run enough or swim enough, then we're never going to get sick, much less are we ever going to get old. That's for suckers. and of course, we'll never die. A slightly dubious set of expectations for a modest pursuit. So I ended up having a lot of fun with this. There's something about the topic that turned out to be not too small, but just right, you know, like the Three Bears, just the right size porridge. And therefore it was tackleable. Sometimes you can take on a subject which is so big that it overwhelms you and you feel that you haven't really been able to contribute anything. Sometimes that's because so many other people have also tackled the same subject. So, you know, your predecessors have done the job for you. But in this particular instance, although we are constantly reading about exercises, right? All those newspaper supplements, all those YouTube videos showing off how you can, you know, work on your abs with your kitchen counter during lockdown. But we don't talk very much about the phenomenon of exercise. In fact, I find it utterly unexamined. And one of the things we don't observe is the fact that something's changed. And it changed gradually. And then I think, especially in the last 10 years, like a lot of social trends, it ramped up and accelerated. So, you know, for this century, more and more, we seem to be consumed with physical fitness. And by the way, I would say that's to the max in Australia, where, you know, Australia has always been pretty sporty. So your baseline was already, you know, pretty extreme. But the last time I went to Australia, which was pretty recently, everyone was wearing athletic gear for everything. You go to the restaurants, everyone was wearing athletic gear. It's just, that's all everyone ever wore. And then when I went to, you know, the park in Sydney, the slopes were covered with people doing press-ups and sit-ups, and there's a set of stairs there. It's mostly kind of decorative, and people were running up and down it constantly. It was manic and kind of insane. So it's worth, I feel that this is kind of an undiscovered topic.
Yeah.
The elements are discussed, you know, how you can improve your a certain muscle group or something. We have all that, but we haven't taken a step back and looked at it. It's like, what are we doing? What is this? And why do we care so much more than we used to?
Yeah, I know, and it's also interesting to explore like why and in what ways it's damaging that it's cultish, because you know, going back to the idea of the responsibility that kind of becomes tied in with the idea that you can, if you take up your exercise regime, you're actually taking responsibility for your health into old age in a way that we almost magically think that we can, you know, that we can have this almost complete determination of how our health goes forward, if only we follow these simple steps. But what do you reckon is damaging about the cultish nature of it? Because it's a healthy pursuit.
Of course it is. And that's one of the tight ropes that the novel has to walk, because being against exercise is like being against koala bears. I mean, you can't say anything bad about exercise. And of course, the book acknowledges all the benefits. We're bored with them. I won't get into it.
Yeah.
So that it's really a question of proportion. And I'm looking at a set of people who have allowed fitness to completely take over their lives. And I'm questioning whether, unless you're a professional athlete, that's necessarily the best use of your time and energies. When it gets that out of control, and that's really all you care about, it seems like a very reductive life, you know, and it's very concentrated on the body. And the body is obviously a part of life, part part of being a person is also managing the little vehicle you get around in.
Yeah.
But I like to regard that as a mechanical issue, because what makes us interesting, both as a species and as individuals, is not, in my mind, because we can run a long way. I mean, lots of animals can do that too, right? They're better at it than we are, most of them. And so I feel that we're allowing our version of what it means to be a person to shrink. And I also try to look at some of the shibboleths of the extreme endurance sport industry and question them. This whole idea, for example, that the only limits on your athletic achievements are in your head, right? I don't think so. There is such a thing as physical limitation, and amateur athletes and professional alike discover the reality of injury, the reality of overdoing it, and the reality of the fact that the body does not purely benefit from use, but also wears out. And that's a big disappointment. Sorry
to interrupt, but I should qualify that this comes from a lifelong exerciser. You're not looking at this from the outside. You're not critiquing it from the outside. You're critiquing it from the inside in some respects.
Entirely. I mean, I know what I'm talking about. I'm part of the problem. And you know, there's a reason that I would have written this book now rather than 20 years ago, because I'm getting old enough to experience some of those limitations myself. Having been an energetic little bunny, there are parts of my body that are starting to wear out even earlier than they might have had I been a little more moderate. I'm a sufficiently fanatic myself that I don't even have the good sense to be regretful. Right. So if I had it to do all over again, I'd probably still wear out my knees prematurely. But that doesn't make me sane, and that isn't sensible. And I do find it hilarious, because I'm, you know, I have a certain extremity about me in relation to everything. So I find it comical that my book is among other things recommending moderation, but there's a great deal to be said for it. And if you get moderate amounts of exercise throughout your life, you keep a sense of proportion. Maybe you do it 3 or 4 times a week. You do other things with your life. You're probably going to survive into old age in better nick than if you go completely bananas.
That sounds like the kind of moderation I would not have expected from Lionel Shriver this evening. Lionel, introduce us to, speaking of people with bad knees, to Serenata Terpsichore and her husband Remington Alabaster. I thought perhaps you might read the first couple of pages of the book to us. Have you got it handy?
I do have it handy. And yes, I think that's probably the best introduction to my 2 main characters. So this is page 1. I've decided to run a marathon. In a second-rate sitcom, she'd have spewed coffee across her breakfast. Yet Serenata was an understated person, and between sips. What? Her tone was a little arch, but polite. You heard me. Back to the stove, Remington studied her with a discomfiting level gaze. I have my eye on the race in Saratoga Springs in April. She had the sense, rare in her marriage, that she should watch what she said. This is serious. You're not pulling my leg. Do I often make statements of intent and then pull the rug out, just fooling? I'm not sure how to take your disbelief as anything but an insult. My disbelief might have something to do with the fact that I've never seen you run from here to the living room. Why would I run to the living room? The literalism had precedent. They called each other out in this nitpicking manner as a matter of course. It was a game. For the last 32 years, you've not once trotted out for a run around the block. And now you tell me with a straight face that you want to run a marathon. You must have assumed I'd be a bit surprised. Go ahead then, be surprised. It doesn't bother you. Serenata continued to feel careful. She didn't care for the carefulness, not one bit. It doesn't bother you that your ambition is hopelessly trite? Not in the least, he said affably. That's the sort of thing that bothers you. Besides, if I decline to run a marathon because so many other people also want to run one, my actions would still be dictated by the multitude. What is this? Some bucket list notion? You've been listening to your old Beatles records and suddenly realized that when I'm 64 refers to you? Bucket list, she repeated, backing off. Where did I get that? Indeed, the incessant citation of the now commonplace idiom was exactly the sort of lemming-like behavior that drove her wild. Okay, there was nothing wrong with adopting a new expression. What galled was the way everyone suddenly started referring to their bucket list in a breezy, familiar spirit that conveyed they had always said it.
Thank you so much. It's a brilliant start to, and that dialogue, that repartee between Serenata and Remington is just rapid fire all the way through the book. It's my most enjoyable part of it. I must say, you dedicate the book to your husband, Jeff, whose luxurious lassitude has spared me the plot of this novel. I take it you didn't have to go far to do your research on Serenata then?
No, I did have to get out of bed. That's about it. Yes, Serenata obviously has some connections with me. But the husband is not especially anything to do with my husband. My husband also does not run from here to the living room. And I think while he might do to get a bit more exercise for his health, he's one of those men who looks remarkably good, regardless of the fact that he never does anything. And I know we've all met those people.
Yeah, well, Remington was like
it's
that.
Not fair.
Yeah, very unfair. Remington vacillates between wanting to live a much longer life through doing all of this hard work, but also, as we progress through the book, is prepared to lay down his life for said same exercise, which is a very curious space that he finds himself in. Have you actually seen that in action with people that you know, or I mean, how did you know that people get into that headspace with extreme sport?
Well, whenever the achievement of something takes over your life, if it's actually doing you some harm, you're likely to turn a blind eye to that. So in the book, he starts developing some chronic injuries. He has a sore hamstring, which is actually not a small injury. And the only way to get it to ease up is to stop running, to let it rest. And of course he doesn't. And then later, not to spoil the plot, but he has an accident and ignores those injuries also. And I think that's credible. And furthermore, with this particular character, there's something a little off about what's driving him to distinguish himself through endurance sport, partly because he's not very good at it, right? So he's always the slowest in his tri-club doing whatever. And furthermore, there's something a little nihilistic about it, something self-abnegating about it. So that, I mean, he's a bright man, very well educated, used to be the second in command of the Department of Transportation in Albany, New York. So he has a long career behind him as a civil servant. He's used to having a lot of responsibility for the way a city and its inhabitants get around. So it's a little odd for him to suddenly just become completely consumed with his body at the age of 64. And therefore, it is a reduction of the size of his world. Obviously, he's reducing the size of his world to his body in order to have some control over it. He lost his previous job in a state of ignominy. It was embarrassing and insulting, and it was a terrible way to end his career. So he feels he has a lot to prove. But there's still a sense, it's not as positive as all that he's proving something good. He is trying to redeem himself, but there's a feeling of almost that he's also punishing himself and trying to destroy himself. And, you know, that's never addressed directly in the book. But there's something dark about his motivation. And I hope the reader picks that up.
Mm. Well, that leads us on to the reason why he has lost his job, and that is through, I guess, a battle with the incompetent diversity hire, Lucinda Okonkwo, who's way too young and way too inexperienced to be taking on the role of Remington's boss, and they soon clash. Tell us a little bit more about her, because here we are again in the classic land of, you know, where you're going to, I guess this is what's made your publishers perhaps a little bit nervous about this book. It's classic Shriver territory. Tell us about Lucinda and about why she is who she is in the book.
Okay, just to back up, I mean, the United States has been employing affirmative action in hiring and in accepting students for university for 50 years. So there's a long history there, more so than any other country I know of. And that's been predominantly during my lifetime. And I've watched that policy really backfire. And I've stuck my neck out on this issue in nonfiction because I think it has all kinds of pernicious side effects. The idea is, of course, to try to level the playing field and to give people who've been traditionally discriminated against a leg up. The trouble is that there's an intrinsic illogic in solving the problem of discrimination with more discrimination, and to solve injustice with more injustice. And I'm afraid that it doesn't work. You just create new injustice, new varieties of unfairness, and there's really no substituting giving people the job who really deserve it and are going to do a good job and are qualified, and letting the students in who have the best record and who have the most potential. The ugliest side effect for me of pursuing affirmative action is that it perpetuates prejudice, because the casual assumption becomes in the broader society that if you are a minority and you're a professional, you know, say a lawyer or something, then you were given a special help. You didn't really earn it, and maybe you're not very good at your job. I think that is horrible, and it also undermines the minorities themselves, who, you know, get the law degree and want it to mean something and feel a little anxious. Would they have got this without, you know, being black, or, you know, checking some little box? So that's the nonfiction background. I think it's a bad idea, and I think the United States has demonstrated amply that it's a bad idea. So one of the things that happens when all you really care about in hiring is ticking a box and making sure that you have the right proportion of minorities in your workforce is that you hire people who are not qualified. So Lucinda Okonkwo is a second generation Nigerian American. She was born in the United States, so she's a US citizen. And her family's rich. Okay. So she's not someone who has is descended from American slaves, and she's not poor. Her family back in Nigeria made a fortune in oil, and you could say she's privileged, right? Aside from the fact that she is female and she is Black, but she's clearly ticked the right boxes for the transportation department and becomes head of the DOT, even though she's only 27 years old and she has a degree in gender studies, which has absolutely nothing to do with transportation. So that's the setup. And they have an encounter in which for 2 seconds, Remington loses his temper. And the other thing I'm looking at is, you can't lose your temper anymore. Anger is now a toxic quantity. And if you ever do lose your temper in an employment situation, you're in big trouble. So he slams his hand on her desk. That's all he does, but that's enough. And then there's an employment tribunal. And, the tribunal is, I did a transcript of it, and it is meant to be fun. If you've had it up to your eyeballs with identity politics and political correctness, then you're going to enjoy it. If you're one of the people who is really big on identity politics, it's probably going to get on your nerves. In fact, it might offend you. And that was a risk that I was willing to take. I mean, I think that people who can roll with the punches and have a sense of humor are going to enjoy it. And that there's a certain type of person that's going to get outraged. And I think some of them are probably book critics.
Yeah. Tell me about, was the inclusion of Lucinda as that character the reason? I know you mentioned that in another interview that your publishers were nervous prior to the release.
Yeah, that, especially the UK people really got anxious.
That it situates this continuous conversation of Lionel Shriver being the person who talks about cultural appropriation from a different perspective, and they want to kind of disconnect you from that conversation. Mm-hmm. What's the problem? And if you're happy to have that conversation, you're happy to write those characters, where does the problem lie for everybody?
I think there was concern, and I think legitimate concern, that because the literary establishment is very left-wing in this country, that it was more than likely that critics were going to go for that one tiny section and ignore the rest of the book. And that has already happened a couple of times, so they were right. I was willing to take that risk. There is a sub-theme that runs through the entire book, which is looking at the state of white American masculinity. And, it is, I compulsively sympathize with people you're not supposed to sympathize with. I know that the white straight males are at the very bottom of the totem pole, and they've always had all the advantages, and now we don't care about them, and we don't want to hear their whining because they've had it good for so long. So shut up. But, when I'm told that I can't feel sorry for somebody, then I feel sorry for them. I think it's really hard to be a man right now. I just do. And it's hard for men to know how to behave, what the rules are, how to court, all the qualities of masculinity that we once treasured are now seen as, seeds of abuse and toxicity. And I think that being male right now is quite paralyzing. So clearly, one of the things that Remington is doing in embracing endurance sport is redeeming himself as a man, because it's all about overcoming suffering, denying pain, it's physical achievement, it's and he buys into the idea that there's something ennobling about it. And that endurance sport is in fact predominantly populated by white men. Yeah. I did notice that there are plenty of women who do it, but it's still much more male, and it is strangely white in the United States at least. And so I thought that was interesting to look at.
Yeah.
And to me, it seemed to me a kind of cultural retreat to hook up with this idea that there's something very reductive about shrinking yourself down to a body. And there are some dialogues in the book that directly address this, about this being a strangely white pursuit, and it being a rather small canvas on which to paint yourself, a small canvas within which to distinguish yourself. It's a sort of a lowering of the horizon that makes it seem a little sad, or at least that's when I'm using it to explore. So Remington's experience of being humiliated and being told he's a racist and he's a misogynist. And by the way, one of the ironies is he comes from a working class background. His father didn't go to university. His mother cleaned fish for a living. So he's not actually from a so-called privileged background. And here's this person who's being given a leg up who isn't. Now, it's true that situation is somewhat constructed, though it's not impossible. That kind of thing does happen. And what I wanted to establish is just this feeling on Remington's part, and he's a stand-in for many other people like him, that everything's stacked against him, and the world has tipped on its head, and everything's unfair. There's no suggestion in the book that he's actually a bigoted person. He's not. In fact, he ends up, by the end of the book, becoming best drinking buddies with the other black character in the book. It's a perception on the part of white male Americans right now that everything is stacked against them. And whether or not that's true, and I would question that, right? The perception is real, and I wanted to express that.
Yeah, there are a couple of comments from the audience saying that, in the sense that it's I'll read one of them for you. Does Lionel feel sorry for people who are still marginalised by the patriarchal minority? I fail to see men losing much of their power, and it kind of leads to what I feel listening to you say that is that I wonder whether you actually believe that is the case for these men, or if it's a position that you can take in your writing that's interesting to you, but isn't necessarily what you subscribe to personally.
Oh, no, it's not necessarily what I subscribe to personally. I would certainly say that men continue to be advantaged over women in most circumstances. And, if you take a look at who is in the legislatures around the world, who leads countries, who's on the boards of companies, I'm not naive, and things are better for women than they used to be, and I'm happy to acknowledge that. And I'm not I don't walk around with a chip on my shoulder, but I recognize that it's still a world run in majority by men. Yeah. I wouldn't correct that with affirmative action for women either, and just because I don't think that's the right way to go about things. There is more of a nudge approach that I think is more effective, which doesn't have to do with meeting a quota, but does mean that you're a little more open-minded about the idea of hiring a woman or a minority than you might otherwise have been. like if you've got completely identical candidates, maybe you choose the woman or the minority. It's a different, see what I mean? It's a gentler approach. And what I really don't like is the mathematical approach. And I think that does lead to bad decisions.
Mm. Although it's one thing to write about it, is another thing to actually deliver on it in a real life sense inside an organization or something, isn't it? You know, where you've got to, it's like, I know that was it Penguin Random House who criticized because they were actually trying to, in their staffing, actually trying to match to some degree of accuracy the representations of all of the cultural groups and genders and sexualities in the community.
Yeah, it was insane. And I made fun of it and then got in a lot of trouble because you can't, partly because because the column I wrote about it was funny, and you're not supposed to make jokes around diversity. But it was, their proposal was incredibly elaborate and very mathematical, because they were planning, it was not only for staff, but it was also for their authors list. And they were promising within a very few number of years, like by 2024 or something, they were giving themselves 5 years to perfectly mirror the proportions in the UK population of, ethnicity, gender. By the way, if they mirrored gender, they'd have to fire an awful lot of editors because they're all women. Sexual orientation, disability. And then they also wanted to get rid of all the educational requirements for their staff. So you didn't have to have any schooling whatsoever to work for Penguin Random House, which I thought, either reflected poorly on Penguin Random House or UK education, if you didn't need it. So, that's a very good example of where I think that's the wrong policy. That's a mathematical approach, it's a quota approach, and it's going to lead to the publication of mediocre books, because what the editors have been instructed is that they have to put together a list that has all these different elements in it. Oh, we need a transgender author, we don't have one, go out and get one. Regardless of how good the work is. That's just no way to run a company. Yeah. And it's also misunderstanding what a company is for. It's supposed to make money and it's supposed to produce something that people want, not to reflect the population in which they're trying to sell something. It's just getting everything backwards. And I took merciless Mickey out of it.
I would love to continue talking to you about this, but there's a couple of things I want to go to. But before I do, you've been having this conversation about cultural appropriation almost continuously. Like through my research, the amount of interviews that I can find of you sitting there going through the same stuff about stating your case on what you feel about cultural appropriation, about the fact that it stemmed from your opening speech at the Brisbane Writers' Festival, and about the reaction that you got to that and how it made international news. And it seems like you're just over and over and over in this loop all the time. And I wondered how you still feel about being that person in that conversation, and whether your attitude or your thought process around it has changed or developed at all during that time.
Well, you're quite right that I'm completely sick of this conversation. And one of the depressing things about having it over and over again is that it keeps reminding me that having the conversation doesn't move the conversation onward. So I'm obviously doing something wrong, or nobody's listening. And that makes the repetition feel ever the more pointless. I do feel as if by now, anyone who has ever heard me speak on this matter or read anything I've written about it, anyone who has not got the message by now, or who is not persuaded by the argument, well, then that's a lost cause, isn't it? I mean, and I originally came to the whole issue feeling at first that it was so self-evidently ludicrous in the context of fiction that it might be boring, and because I don't like to make self-evident points. And I've been distressed to discover that it's not self-evident to everyone. The trouble is that when I first spoke about it in 2016, it wasn't really a big problem in fiction. And that's one of the reasons I wasn't sure that that original speech was going to work, because I didn't have that many examples of where fiction writers had been persecuted for writing characters that were different from themselves. And since, I'm afraid that it's happened a lot. So obviously my speech didn't help, and all those other interviews that you've encountered hasn't helped. And I expect that one more isn't going to make any difference.
Yeah.
I keep waiting for this whole movement to burn itself out. And maybe if we sink into a worldwide depression as a consequence of the coronavirus, we'll all be too disheartened to get into these kinds of ridiculous arguments.
It is a perfect segue in a lot of senses into the next part of the conversation, because although you wrote The Mandibles in 2016, it's so much aligned with what's going on in the world at the moment. I'd be remiss not to mention it. It's set in the near future in the US, but perhaps a little too far away when you wrote it, what, kind of maybe 5 years ago?
Yeah, well, it was published in 2016, so I probably started in 2014, and it's set in 2029, which is, you know, I couldn't resist that year because it's just exactly 100 years since the stock market crash in 1929, and I thought maybe I was pushing the program in choosing that date, and it turns out that it's too late. I obviously should have said it in 2020, because I'm very anxious about the consequences of all these lockdowns going on at the same time. I think that one of the things that The Mandibles gets at is the incredible fragility of our monetary system. And it's a book that explores what it's like for one family. So it's not like just reading an economics textbook. It's very granular, what it's like to go to the supermarket. Ironically, when the economy starts to plummet and the dollar becomes more and more worthless, one of the first things that people start hoarding is toilet paper. And I was grimly satisfied to have got that detail right.
I laughed out loud.
Yeah. But I think it's a genuinely frightening book. The only thing that makes it unfrightening is that it's not real, and that's its only comfort, that it's not happening now, and you can put the book down. Because, you know, there's a lot of talk right now about, human life is more important than money, so we don't need to worry about the economy. All we have to do is make sure that nobody dies of COVID-19. But it's such a misunderstanding of what an economy is. And, when the systems by which we trade with each other and get food, when they fall apart, everything falls apart. And civilization becomes desperate and violent. And I don't want that for my country. I don't want that for the UK. I certainly don't want that for Australia. But that's what you're playing with. Real, just total civilizational decay. And we are already in a situation where most of our governments are heavily indebted. And now we're suddenly talking about taking on, 50% more debt. I think it's terrifying, because there's a certain point at which, and you never know when you get to it, that people stop believing in money. Money, we were talking about the cult of exercise. Well, money is also a religion. It's something that you have to believe in order for it to function. And once we have become so indebted internationally, we're coming awfully close to it, then nobody's going to ever pay this all back. It's all going to be inflated away. You court your currency becoming worthless. And that's really what the Mandibles is looking at. But currency is one of the systems that we need to remain sound. And complex, largely urban civilizations can't function without a currency that has value. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't know how to grow wheat in my garden. I can't survive without currency. I'm too incompetent an animal, right? I can't take care of myself. I can't grow my own food. So the Mandibles, I mean, if you want something that is pertinent to the time and isn't necessarily about disease, it is not about disease. I'm afraid the Mandibles is ideal reading for COVID-19.
Yeah, I actually felt like I needed to take notes after a while, that I should, kind of use your foresight to write down, what to look for, signs of what to expect still coming, and, what I should do about it to head it off. It was, but I particularly wanted to ask you about the column that you wrote in The Spectator just recently about your dismay at how people have submitted to this lockdown. Because I'm really curious as to, I mean, it is, as you say, the trade-off between the loss of human life, but also the loss of the world as we know it on a much greater scale. But I saw an article today saying Boris Johnson saying, to those of you who have to go out and work, well, good luck. Do you see that that's probably what has to happen now in the UK as well?
Well, there's a lot of evidence accumulating that these lockdowns have not been epidemiologically effective. So, leave aside, they've certainly been effective insofar as having a result economically. That's not up for grabs. We know they've been incredibly destructive, and it's going to be very difficult to put things back together. It's a lot easier. It's always easier to wreck things than to construct them. So what is falling apart right now, all these companies going bankrupt, took decades to put together. You can destroy them in 3 months easily. But I've been dismayed that there's been so little discussion in the media about the lockdown phenomenon itself, whether it's necessary. After all, we've had diseases come and go forever, right? Including viruses. The Hong Kong flu in 1968 killed 100,000 Americans, for example, and 80,000 Brits, which is more than the coronavirus by a factor of 2 so far. We didn't close anything, right? We didn't close a single school, didn't close a single business. It was just like, well, that's a drag. And it went through the population, and it doesn't mean that those deaths didn't matter or didn't deeply bereave families and friends, but that's life. And then suddenly we have another virus come along. It doesn't appear to be quite that lethal so far, but even if it is, why do we suddenly have this other protocol? So, and also most importantly, why do we not have more questioning of that protocol? If this is a new thing to do and obviously has horrible consequences, potentially for years to come, why don't we take a look at it? And if you look at the curve of infections, in most countries, the curve starts coming down before the lockdowns could conceivably have had any effect on that curve. And there's no point in the curve that you suddenly see infections drop because the lockdown has taken effect, and it's not happening. They don't work. And so I've been dismayed. Why are there not more voices out there? And even if I'm wrong, okay, and I accept that, I'm often wrong. So even though I'm totally wrong, there should be more people like me saying wrong things. The homogeneity of the media message on this has been creepy, because it's been exactly the same as the government's message. And that's propaganda. And that means that you're not having a vital public discussion of measures that are affecting everyone, absolutely everyone. There's nobody who's out there that this isn't touching. So in that it's all of our business, we should be able to talk about it, and we should be able to look at the evidence. And instead, especially, I get the American and British news. It's all the same. They all same. Be patriotic, stay home. That's it.
You feel like it.
And there are lots of I hate that word, epidemiologists. I did it. Who, by the way, I'm pointing at our TV. who are dissenters, right? And believe that this lockdown business is not effective in combating the virus, or who believe that the virus has a natural pathway which is going to take regardless. And if you line up all the different countries with their many different policies, it takes the same curve everywhere, roughly. But they're not on TV. They're not in TV, and for the most part, they're not in the newspapers. You have to go looking for them. So it shouldn't be that way.
Do you think it's because we're placing too high a value on human life?
I'm not sure I accept that way of putting it. We're placing too high a value on a certain kind of human life that is in the immediate present, and we're not safeguarding our society as a whole, which is the same. Society as a whole is nothing but an accumulation of human lives. So that you can't say that wanting to protect the society as a whole is not being interested in the preservation of human life. It's also about the preservation of the human life. That discussion we just had about economics and how I can't feed myself without a society, without a functional economy. I will starve, right? So we are not having political leaders who are looking out for the interest of the country. And that means over the long term and over the medium term, not just this year or this month trying to get the fatality rates of a particular disease down as low as possible. They're being incredibly irresponsible. And what really confuses me is why this particular brand of irresponsibility has spread all over the world. I just don't get it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Except for Sweden. What's with Sweden? Well, Sweden has not had a lockdown. They have not destroyed their economy. Their infection rates are sort of in the middle range. They do have a problem with care homes because they tend to put the elderly in very large care homes. And I think that on the level of infection, that's probably stupid. But still, they're doing okay without telling everyone to stay home. And they've kept their schools open, and they've kept their restaurants and cafes open. And when this finally settles down, they'll probably have herd immunity earlier than most countries. And while they'll still take an economic hit because there has been some social distancing, and I think people have been going to restaurants more rarely, they're going to still be in much better shape than most countries. So, there's been a lot of effort to discredit Sweden because it makes world leaders elsewhere really anxious. Because if it turns out that you didn't need to close down your entire economy, then they made a mistake on an historic level. And I think that you're going to see going forward that Trump or Boris Johnson, they're going to end up endlessly justifying the lockdowns, because if they weren't necessary, if they didn't work, it was a horrible, horrible thing to do. And the consequences are going to be long lasting.
We've only got a few minutes left, Lionel. So I just wanted, there's a lot of comments that have come up that I'm not going to read out, but there are a couple of questions, if you don't mind. They're
Sure.
backtracking on the conversation a little bit, but my friend Neil is asking, as both a man and a proud male feminist who also acknowledges his own white male privilege, I see value in your observations on the modern white man needing a space to adjust to the new norm where masculinity is concerned. I also find value in your comment of extreme exercise being reductive or escapist. I'm also a gym enthusiast and see this firsthand. My question is, do you feel that this level of commitment to fitness is the same for women?
Often. Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things that's changed. When I was a kid, women and girls were not interested in strength, and muscles were seen as kind of gross. I was something of an outlier at that time, but that's completely transformed. And in general, I think for it's better that women are also interested in fitness, and women also now want to be strong, and we admire a woman who has a nice, well-defined set of muscles, and that's not entirely a bad thing, although there is a downside, and women have traditionally been encouraged to worry a bit too much about what they look like, and this is one more thing you have to worry about, and it's potentially in order to be a player, in order to meet the beauty standards of today, it potentially requires an enormous investment of time and energy. So there's a downside to that for women. I mean, it's also a trap for women. You know, now that we're all supposed to have six packs and biceps, and you know, it used to be that, you know, you had to be incredibly skinny and in order to be considered to be beautiful, and that's bad enough. So you're starving yourself all the time. Now you have to starve yourself all the time. Spend 4 hours every day in the gym. That's not good for women.
Yeah, just adds to the pressure. There are two questions for two different people asking the question. I'd love to know what's in the picture frame behind Lionel. It looks like paper clippings, but of what? Conversation. So.
That's my collage of headlines and newspaper articles. I collected them for years. I still collect them. I have piles. And they're mostly things that I found that entertained me, or I found particularly absurd. There's like woman sues for being born. Man kills wife for giving him too many Brussels sprouts. So yeah, it's just fun, and when I have people over for dinner, well, they end up going to the collage and finding their favorite.
I can't believe there's only one of them. Is there only one of them? One.
Well, my husband has encouraged me that I have to start thinking about a second one.
Oh. Lionel,
yeah, after all, the world has not run out of absurdity.
No, absolutely true. As long as you're around, we won't have grown out of absurdity, because you will remind us of how absurd the world is. Lionel, The Motion of the Body Through Space is an absolutely fantastic read. I've enjoyed it so much, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. It means a lot to us to have access to international authors of your calibre whilst being in this strange situation, and goodness knows how long it will be before we'll be face-to-face in a writers' festival.
No. Well, I'll tell you what, the next time I'm in Australia, I will doubly appreciate the fact that I was allowed to go there in person. So until then, this is the next best thing, and I thank your audience for sparing their valuable time to listen to me talk.
Thank you. And I should say to everyone that the strong sentiment in organising these conversations is that the event is available to everyone, but then that you would then source your book, source Lionel's books from your local bookshop, so that we are actually still supporting our local communities at this strange time. We do have a couple more events coming up. Curtis Sittenfeld on May 26th will be talking about her new novel Rodham, in which she depicts the alternative outcome where Hillary doesn't marry Bill. And then the week after, on the 3rd, we'll be talking to Polly Sampson on her book, A Theatre for Dreamers, which is a novel about the entanglement of musicians and artists and writers, including Leonard Cohen and Charmian Clift, who lived in the early 60s on the Greek island of Hydra. Lionel, warmest thanks again so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night.